Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. I hope that you're having a wonderful day today. When you hear the words hippie free love commune, your mind probably goes to the free love movement of the swinging 60s, fueled by the newly invented birth control pill. You almost certainly do not think of the stereotypically prudish and sexually repressed Victorian era. But what if I were to tell you that a small town in upstate New York was home to a hippie free love commune all the way back in the mid-19th century? In today's video, we are going to be discussing the Oneida community, which was just that, a hippie free love commune, or some may say cult, that was active from the late 1840s all the way up until 1880. Before we get into that, I'd like to remind you to please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you can be notified of future uploads. I would also like to remind you to please like the video and leave a comment down below. That's very, very helpful for boosting this video in the algorithm. I've also linked my Instagram down below, and I would love it if you would follow me there, because it's free. And I've also linked my email down below in case you need to get in touch with me. Before beginning, I'd like to issue a content warning. This video is going to deal with topics such as the death of infants, sexual abuse, and the abuse of children. If you are not currently able to handle a discussion of any of these things, then I beg you, please watch one of my other videos instead. Before we can fully understand the Oneida community, we first need to touch upon the 3 or maybe 4, the number is debated, religious Great Awakenings that have swept through America since its beginning. The first Great Awakening swept the nation from roughly 1730 to 1755. The second Great Awakening happened between roughly 1790 to 1840, and then the third Great Awakening happened from, again, roughly 1855 to 1930. The disputed fourth Great Awakening took place between 1960 and 1980. So what is a Great Awakening? Well, it's a distinctly American phenomenon. They do happen elsewhere, but they're much more common in America. It's a religious revival movement where religion is spread throughout the country through very bombastic and emotional sermoning and preaching, and it leads to an awakening of spiritual belief in a lot of people. And they can also oftentimes lead to the creation and or popularization of new religions or denominations. Some of the religions that were either created in or popularized in Great Awakenings that still exist today are Shakerism, Presbyterianism, Methodism, Baptism, and Quakerism, which is my own religion. The Great Awakenings could be a video series of their own. Let me know if you're interested. They're very, very complex and incredibly interesting, but for the purposes of this video, all you need to know is that during these 4 periods of time in American history, there was a great outpouring of religious and spiritual sentiment, and that this rise in spiritual and religious feeling led to the rise of a lot of evangelical, nonconformist, and even folk religions in America in these time periods. One of the leaders of the Second Great Awakening, which again took place from roughly 1790 to 1840, was a man named Charles Grandison Finney, who is known as the father of old revivalism. Finney was known for traveling around New England and Pennsylvania and giving very bombastic and impassioned sermons and spreading the gospel of the Lord. In 1830, in Brattleboro, Vermont, a young man named John Humphrey Noyes heard Finney preaching, and that sermon caused a religious awakening in young Noyes, who later recalled that from that point on, quote, "My heart was fixed upon the millennium, and I resolved to live or die for it." When Noyes spoke of the millennium, he was not speaking of Y2K. He was speaking of Christ's 1,000-year-long rule on earth, which is prophesied in the book of Revelations. Quote, "And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, and had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The goal of many of these revivalist religions was to bring about this 1,000-year reign, although the Bible does say that that's not something that people can do. It's not within our control, but people like to take matters into their own hands. Shortly after experiencing this religious awakening, Noyes graduated from Dartmouth College. Although he had originally planned to study law, this awakening caused him to change his plans, and he instead decided to become a church minister. To that end, he enrolled at the Yale Theological Seminary in 1832 after a short stint at the Andover Theological Seminary. While he was at seminary, Noyes became involved in political action when he founded an anti-slavery society at New Haven. Political activism was a very common theme with these revivalist religions. It pops up in a lot of them. A lot of them are very, very political in their nature. One of the best examples of this is my own religion, as I mentioned before, the Religious Society of Friends, commonly called Quakers. Now, although Quakerism was not invented during one of the religious revivals, it was definitely popularized and grew quite a bit during the first and second religious revivals in the United States. The Quakers have been deeply involved in pretty much every progressive political movement in American history. Up until his second year in seminary, Noyes was relatively normal, but For some reason, in his second year of seminary, that changed, and Noyes became convinced that we were already living in the millennium, and that in fact the second coming of Christ had happened all the way back in 70 AD, and that, quote, mankind was now living in a new age. I don't know how Noyes was able to justify the fact that had the second coming of Christ happened back in 70 AD, then the millennium would have ended in 1070 AD, and he was saying this in 1834, but you'll have to ask him how the math works out, because in my mind, the math is not mathing, as the kids say. This new revelation inspired in Noyes a great interest in sin and salvation, even greater than would be expected for a man who is attending seminary. And he eventually came to the rather bizarre belief that people can be without sin while they are yet alive on earth, and that the only true Christians were the people who were already living without sin. This is a very unorthodox belief. If you have even the most passing familiarity with Christian theology, you'll know that most Christian denominations, however different they may be, are generally bound by the belief that humans are inherently sinful, we're inherently flawed, and we're born into sin, and the only truly sinless human to have ever lived was Jesus Christ. So this is a very, very unorthodox view that Noyes held. As unorthodox as this belief was, Noyes did not invent it. It is a fringe religious belief called perfectionism, and it was born from the preaching of Charles Grandison Finney. Noyes latched on to perfectionism with a passion, and on February 20th, 1834, he declared that he, John Humphrey Noyes, was perfect and without sin. He contended that because he had surrendered his will entirely to God, everything he did was perfect, because everything he did was done with a perfect heart. After declaring himself perfect and declaring that all of his actions came directly from God, Noyes went on to declare that he was under no obligation to follow any legal or moral societal norms, because what right has society to rebuke God? Now, I need hardly tell you how absolutely terrifying this is. In one fell swoop, Noyes had given himself carte blanche to do whatever he pleased. If you're raising your eyebrows at this perfectionist zealotry, you're not the only one. Noyes' friends at this time described him as being unbalanced, and some of his professors at the seminary even called him a heretic. His February 20th declaration of his own sinlessness caused an outrage and an uproar that would eventually lead to the revocation of his newly earned preaching license. Not that this bothered Noyes, he went right on preaching. Entirely unfazed by the revocation of his license, he returned to Putney, Vermont, and he continued preaching, saying, quote, I took away their license to sin, and they kept sinning. They have taken away my license to preach, but I shall go on preaching. In 1838, Noyes married a woman named Harriet Holton, and for 6 years they lived a relatively normal life together. In that time, Harriet Holton gave birth 5 times, but only one of those children would survive infancy. And it has been speculated that all of these pregnancies and the subsequent loss of so many children was what inspired in Noyes an obsession that would last for the rest of his life. Specifically, at this point in time, Noyes became very interested in and began to deeply study amorous congress, specifically a practice which he called male continuance, but which has also been called coitus reservatus. Now, I want you to put a pin in male continuance because that's going to become incredibly important in a little while. In 1846, Noyes developed a romantic attraction to the wife of his friend, George Craigan. Instead of just getting over it like a normal person would have done, or instead of even having an affair with her like a normal pervert would have done, Noyes instead somehow convinced the Craigans and his own wife, Harriet, to merge their 2 separate marriages into one joint marriage. This meant that everybody could engage in amorous congress with everybody else, and in practice it meant that Noyes could now engage in congress with Craigan's wife. It's unclear to me whether Craigan and Harriet Holton engaged in congress together and whether the 2 men engaged in congress with each other or the 2 women. The historical record is pretty sparse when it comes to details of that nature. Essentially, they had developed a system that would, I think, today be called a polycule, although if I'm incorrect about that, please let me know. But Noyes called it complex marriage. I want you to put a pin in complex marriage as well, because that is also going to become incredibly important later on. The Craigans and the Noyes all moved into a house together, where they lived presumably quite happily until October 1847, when Noyes was, unsurprisingly, indicted in New Haven for adulterous fornication. Instead of sticking around to face the charges against him, Noyes, after being arraigned, fled with his followers to Oneida, New York, and it was there, in 1848, that the Oneida community was born. The community grew steadily throughout the late 1840s and early 1850s until in the mid-1850s it was large enough and wealthy enough for the community to afford to build their own house. Now, the community did not believe in personal possessions, so when somebody joined the community, their property would be forfeit to the community as a whole, which is how they got so much money. In 1855, they built what is often called the first mansion house, but people kept on steadily joining the community at such a rate that after just a few years, this first mansion house was overcrowded. By 1862, the crowding had gotten so bad that the mansion house was torn down or maybe sold and the community moved. I'm not quite sure what happened to the old mansion house. But in 1862, they built a new house, creatively called the new mansion house. A south wing was added in 1869, and another addition was added between 1877 and 1878. The new mansion house was, and still is, it still exists, a 3-story tall building with a 5-story Italianate tower that had its own entrance. The first floor of the mansion house contained administrative offices, a reception room, a library, a guest bedroom, and some sleeping rooms for the members. The second floor contained more sleeping rooms for the members. Public community space was very, very important for the members of the Oneida community, so much so that the first mansion house didn't even have its own private bedrooms. Instead, it had what was called a sleeping hall, and everybody would just go into that room, and some of them, if they wanted a little bit of privacy, could pitch tents indoors, but that was about all they got. The community members did get private bedrooms in the new mansion house, but they were assigned on a rotational basis, so nobody would stay in one single room for too long, so nobody would develop an emotional attachment to any single room, because any kind of emotional attachment was considered to be absolutely unforgivable by this community. The most important room in the new mansion house was a large auditorium that was called the Family Hall. The community would gather in the family hall every evening at 8 o'clock to hear Noyes preach, hear readings, and to engage in something called mutual criticism. I want you to also put a pin in mutual criticism because that is also going to become very important later on. Although the mansion house had the capacity to hold about 700 residents, at its height the community only ever numbered around 300. In spite of its relatively small size, the community was governed with a staggering, shocking amount of bureaucracy involving 27 standing committees and 48 administrative sections. All members worked according to their abilities, and women generally, although not exclusively, remained in the domestic spheres, and unskilled labor was done on a rotational basis. Skilled jobs tended to remain the purview of one single person. For example, the man who was responsible for the financial management of the community kept that job for his entire time as part of the community. As the community grew, they also began to find it necessary to hire in non-community members to help with the work of running the mansion house. And by 1870, there were 200 non-community members who were employed by the community. So now that we have a little bit of background about how the community came to be and about where they lived, we should look at the community itself. How did the members live their day-to-day lives, and what did they believe? Earlier in this video, I mentioned something called mutual criticism. Criticism was very, very important to the Oneida community. People could be criticized privately in a one-on-one kind of basis. They could be criticized by several people, or they could even be criticized during the nightly meetings by the entire community. And I cannot imagine anything worse than being criticized by 300 people. I cannot tell you how quickly I would just collapse into a puddle on the floor if I were in that situation. The purpose of this criticism was to eliminate undesirable character traits, and no community member was safe from it. Not even Noyes himself. There are records of him being criticized occasionally, which does confuse me a bit because I thought he was perfect. I thought he was the embodiment of God. So it seems to me that criticizing Noyes would be like criticizing God himself, which I don't think any of us have the right to do. But again, you'll have to ask Noyes about that one. I'm simply not enlightened enough to be able to explain it. At one point, I'm not sure quite when, a journalist named Charles Nordhoff observed the criticism of a man whom he identified only as Charles, and he described it thusly, quote, "Charles sat speechless, looking before him, but as the accusations multiplied, his face grew paler, and drops of perspiration began to stand on his forehead. The remarks took up to about half an hour, and now, each one in the circle having spoken, Mr. Noyes summed up. I just want to interject really briefly and say that I think Charles took this like a champ. If I had been being criticized by 300 different people, I would have done a lot more than growing pale and starting to sweat." But to get back to the quote, Mr. Noyes summed up. He said that Charles had some serious faults, that he had watched him with some care, and that he thought that the young man was earnestly trying to cure himself. He spoke in general praise of his ability and his good character, and of certain temptations that he had resisted in the course of his life. He thought he saw signs that Charles was making a real and earnest attempt to conquer his faults. And as one evidence of this, he remarked that Charles had lately come to him and consulted him upon a difficult case in which he had had a severe struggle. But in the end, he had succeeded in doing right. Quote, "In the course of what we call Stirpiculture," me interjecting again, put a pin in Stirpiculture, that's also going to become very important later. I'm sorry to have to keep on having you put so many pins in things. If I were to explain everything as soon as it came up, this video would be very difficult to follow. Back to the quote. "In the course of what we call Stirpiculture, Charles is in the situation of one who is by and by to become a father. Under these circumstances, he has fallen under the too common temptation of selfish love, and the desire to wait upon and cultivate an exclusive intimacy with the woman who was to bear a child through him. This is an insidious temptation, very apt to attack people under such circumstances, but it must nevertheless be struggled against. Charles," he went on to say, "had come to him for advice in this case, and that he, Noyes, had at first refused to tell him anything, but had asked him what he thought he ought to do, and after some conversation Charles had determined, and he, Noyes, had agreed with him, that he ought to isolate himself entirely from the woman, and let another man take his place by her side. And this Charles had accordingly done, with the most praiseworthy spirit of self-sacrifice. Charles had indeed still further taken up his cross, as he, Noyes, had noticed with pleasure, by going to sleep with the smaller children to take charge of them during the night. Taking all this in view, he, Noyes, thought that Charles was in a very fair way to becoming a better man, and had manifested a sincere desire to improve and to rid himself of all selfish faults." This man, Charles's transgression, was to become attached to the woman who was carrying his own child. It is very telling about the practices of the Oneida community that that is considered to be such a serious transgression. Noyes was deeply interested in and spent a lot of time researching a practice that he called male continuance, which is also called coitus reservatus. It is defined in its Wikipedia page as a form of amorous congress in which the male attempts not to hem within his partner, but instead avoids the emission. Noyes was a proponent of male continuance for several reasons. The first reason for which the Oneida community practiced male continuance was very practical. It was, for the time, a relatively reliable form of contraception, although of course we have much better forms available to us now. Because everybody in the community was considered to be married to everybody else in the community, there was a great deal of amorous congress going on in the mansion house. This means that, had they not been careful, the community would have fast become overrun with children. This method seems to have worked reasonably well, as between 1848 and 1868, there were only 12 unplanned births within the community. Until they got the hang of it, the young men of the community would practice on postmenopausal women, who would act as a sort of mentor for the younger men, so that there was very little danger of a child resulting should the young man happen to get carried away. They would only start engaging in congress with women of childbearing years once they were judged to have become proficient in the practice of continuance. Similarly, the older men of the community would take on a sort of mentor role with the younger women of the community. These mentors acted not only as mentors in the realm of marital purposes, but also in a spiritual capacity, serving as religious role models for their young partners. The other reason for which the Oneida community practiced male continuance was, quote, to subordinate the flesh to the spirit, teaching men to seek the elevated spiritual pleasures of connection. Noyes further believed that the act of emission, quote, drained a man's vitality and led to disease. This was a very common belief at this time. I have a book from the 1860s that is called Self-Preservation, which is basically a guide on how to avoid venereal diseases, and it espouses this very same belief. Noyes also believed that pregnancy and childbirth, quote, levied a tax upon the vitality of women. In spite of these two beliefs, Noyes did eventually decide that it was time to experiment with bringing children into the Oneida community, which leads us to the next core tenet of their beliefs. This was the community's word for the planned conception, birth, and rearing of children, and the experiment took place between 1869 and 1879. Noyes wondered if spirituality might perhaps be a heritable trait, and to find that out, the most spiritual members of the community, 53 women and 38 men, were chosen to partner together and to bear children, 58 in total, 9 of whom were fathered by Noyes himself. These children, who were known as Stirpicults, would remain with their mothers for the first 15 months of their lives. After the child had been weaned, it would be sent to the south wing of the mansion house, which the community called the children's wing, and there it would be raised by the community. Breastfeeding for the first 15 months was the only form of close connection between mother and child that was encouraged or even tolerated by the community. As I've said before, any kind of individual attachment was considered to be very, very bad by the community, and the Stirpicults were considered to be children of the community, not of any one individual or two individual people. After being weaned and moved into the children's wing, the child would continue to sleep in its mother's room for a little while, but when it had reached an appropriate age, I don't know what age exactly that was, it would begin to sleep in the bed of another community member. And this community member would be changed every so often. And this was ostensibly to prevent the child from becoming especially attached to any specific community member. I'm sure that I'm not the only one who is made deeply uncomfortable by this practice, and I can also not be the only one who fears that some bad actors may have taken advantage of this practice to devastating effect. And if anybody was wondering, spirituality does not seem to be an inheritable trait, as the Stirpicults were not particularly spiritual, and everybody said that they were relatively ordinary children. The position of women in the Oneida community is a little bit difficult to determine. On one hand, it seems that they may have enjoyed more rights than might have some of the women in normal society. We can see from photographs that all of the women are wearing the reform dress and have their hair cropped short. We also know that although women did stick to domestic spheres generally, they were not confined to domestic spheres and could presumably participate in all forms of work if they so chose. However, the Oneida community was certainly no paradise for women, as the sad case of Tryphenia Hubbard can attest. Tryphenia Hubbard joined the community in 1848 when she was 21 years old, right after the community had settled in Oneida, New York. In that same year, she married a community member named Henry Seymour. This was very early days, and it was before the doctrine of complex marriage and the horror of developing individual attachments had been fully ironed out. So at this point, community members were allowed to enter into marriages with each other, but their marriages would have been, in modern terms, open ones. In 1849, Tryphenia Hubbard's father, Oneida Hubbard, learned of the open nature of his daughter's marriage and demanded that she come home. She refused. We know that in 1850, Tryphenia was criticized for being insubordinate and for her, quote, immense egotism amounting to insanity. This is a tantalizingly vague account, and I wish that I could provide more information about what behaviors led to the label of excessive egotism. It was decided that the best way of correcting these supposed character flaws in Tryphenia was to increase her husband's control over her and to institute discipline in the form of physical punishments. Basically, they decided to start beating her. Unsurprisingly, in 1851, Tryphenia Hubbard, now Tryphenia Seymour, began to display signs of severe mental instability, specifically crying at night and speaking incoherently. Eventually, it got so bad that her overwhelmed husband, Henry Seymour, told her parents of her madness and also of the community's methods of treating her madness. Her parents were, understandably, horrified by the accounts of the physical violence enacted against their daughter. In September of 1851, Oneida Hubbard lodged assault and battery charges against Seymour and several other members of the community on his daughter's behalf. Seymour was indicted on these charges, and several other members of the community were arrested as accessories. The Hubbard-Miller case was settled out of court on November 26, 1851. The community paid Tryphenia Hubbard's medical and asylum expenses in addition to giving her family a one-time payment of $350, which is the equivalent to roughly $15,000 in 2025 money. After her release from the asylum, Tryphenia Seymour returned to her husband, and they eventually had one child together. Tryphenia Seymour, née Hubbard, died in 1877 at the age of 49. The fact that the community was willing and able to treat an innocent young woman in this way, I think hints at a much darker underside to the community's view of and treatment of women. This is the part you've all been waiting for. Complex marriage is, at its most basic reduction, an early form of free love. Any consenting member of the community was free to engage in amorous congress with any other consenting member of the community. I have been unable to determine exactly how expansive this freedom was. Were the men of the community considered to be married to the other men of the community in addition to the women of the community? And were the women of the community considered to be married to the other women of the community in addition to the men of the community? I just don't know. The historical record is very spotty on this point, and I cannot say confidently either way. I can say that it seems to me that if homosexuality was practiced by community members, it was not very common. I found many sermons and writings lambasting the community for all of their various unorthodox practices, and these pamphlets and sermons do not pull punches when it comes to criticizing the Oneida community. I can only imagine that if homosexuality was common there, it would have been mentioned in at least one of these sermons or pamphlets, and it isn't. So that makes me think that if it was being practiced, it was unusual enough to go unremarked upon. If any of you have any more information on this point, please let me know. We do know that consent was important for the community. Nobody could force somebody else to engage in amorous congress against their will. We know this because before he assassinated President James A. Garfield, Charles Guiteau actually joined the Oneida community for a brief amount of time, but nobody would sleep with him and they nicknamed him Charles Get Out, which, although it is quite sad, is also objectively hilarious. But we know that he could not force anybody to engage in congress with him against their will. Above all things, possessiveness and exclusivity were straight verboten in the community. Noyes considered monogamy to be selfish. All men were spiritually married to all women and vice versa, and anybody, male or female, was free to make or reject the advances of any other person. Noyes called a romantic attachment to an individual selfish love, and it was completely forbidden. In spite of its being forbidden, it seems to have been a recurring problem for the community, especially among the younger members, who seemed to have had a tendency to form special attachments with individuals. Some sources say that couples would need to get Noyes' permission before they were allowed to engage in amorous congress, but I've not been able to verify that claim, and it actually seems a little bit unlikely to me, since everybody in the community was considered to be married to everybody else, and everybody was expected to have relationships with everybody else, and by all accounts, they did. So the idea that Noyes would specifically throw obstacles in the way of people achieving something that was very important to him seems a bit odd to me. Noyes believed that there were two different types of amorous congress, which he called amative and propagative. Amative congress was for the purposes of expressing love and affection. Propagative congress was for childbearing, and of course, when members were engaging in propagative congress, they would not practice male continuance. One thing that was rather shockingly not forbidden in the Oneida community was incest. Noyes' own brother, George Washington Noyes, fathered a child by his much younger niece, Tirsa Miller. Tirsa Miller was also John Humphrey Noyes' niece. She was the daughter of George Washington Noyes and John Humphrey Noyes' sister. She kept a relatively extensive diary, which can give us insight into some of the more depraved inner workings of the Oneida community. I'm going to read you 3 of her different diary entries. On April 26, 1869, Tirsa Miller wrote, quote, "I have felt rather bad lately, fearing that if I remain so unmagnetic, Mr. Noyes," who is again her uncle, "will not love me any more. Tonight he asked me if I would like to go and sleep with him. I hope I can sometime again, I said. Let's try it tonight, he said. No, I'm unwell now, I said. Well, whenever you are ready and feel like it, we will, he said. Father Noyes, I think it puts a ligature on my life to be separated from you in this way, I said. No, I guess not, he answered. You are getting united to me in a different way, he said. I hope so, I said. Let's go off and take a long walk in the woods, he said. Oh, I should like that, I said. Well, someday, when the weather is all right and you feel like it, we will, he said. During this conversation, he said, But how much have you been with these other chaps lately? I told him that I had only stayed away twice since his talk with me, and meant to follow the course of attraction. He was much pleased with that, and he said he thought I had done well with the paper during Aunt H's absence. In that entry, Tirsa Miller mentions that she feels unmagnetic towards Noyes. I would imagine probably because he was her uncle and because he was much older than she was. The community used the word magnetism or magnetic to express the mystical law of attraction. They believed that everything and everyone everywhere in the universe was connected, and that due to this connection, they were all drawn together in a metaphorical but also seemingly physical sense. It's heartbreaking for me to read these diary entries in which Tirsa Miller is lambasting herself for not wanting to engage in Congress with her own uncle, who was at this point an old man. On April 6, 1869, she wrote, Quote, slept with John Humphrey Noyes. I dreaded to go because I knew he must discover my unmagnetic condition. He did fast enough. In the night he said, quote, would you like some criticism? I said, yes, I should very much. He said, well, there is no disguising the fact that you don't attract me. You impress me with the feelings that your amorous nature has been abused by your entering into amorous congress without appetite. Spirits of men which are indigestible to you have come between you and me. I said, it is true that I have engaged in congress with men without any appetite, and done so a great deal lately. He said, but why do you? I thought you promised me once that you wouldn't. I told him that I had not quite dared just to follow my attractions in that aspect, but he said that I must, or it would spoil it all for me. That is true even now, for I have been away so much this winter in a kind of duty-doing spirit for folks for whom I had no attraction, that I've lost all appetite for congress with the men whom I love, and have always had splendid times with. I have felt that it was a great expense to me and was taking all the romance out of my life. But I didn't know what to do, and thought that it was my duty. Oh, I feel so relieved. I had hardly dared to hope that I needed to do anything in this line but what I felt an attraction for. Although officially nobody in the community could force anybody in the community to engage in amorous congress against their will, the way in which Miller writes about her multiple encounters with her uncle and also with other men in the community reveals an ugly truth. Although a woman was, for all intents and purposes, perfectly free to refuse to engage in congress with a man if she was disinclined to do so, if she did refuse to engage, or if she did not do so enthusiastically enough, she would be made to feel as though there was something wrong or lacking within herself. This probably led to a good deal of women engaging in congress with men when they did not actually wish to. The worst entry in Miller's diary by a landslide is also one of the shortest, at only 2 sentences long. On March 27, 1869, she wrote, quote, last night, John Humphrey Noyes talked with me about having amorous congress performed on the stage. He said, quote, we shall never have heaven till we can conquer shame and make a beautiful exhibition on the stage. In this entry, she is almost certainly referring to the raised stage or dais at the end of the family hall. Her use of the word performance and his reference to the stage and to a beautiful exhibition can only really lead me to believe that John Humphrey Noyes wanted to engage in amorous congress with his niece on the stage in front of the entire congregation, which is a thought too awful for words. Her diary does not confirm or deny whether or not this actually happened, or whether it was just some deranged fantasy of Noyes's, but either way, it is truly horrifying. The community began to decline in the late 1870s. The decline was brought about by several different factors. One major reason was that an aging Noyes was attempting to pass leadership of the community off to his son, Theodore, who is generally described as being untalented and agnostic, which are perhaps not the best traits for a person who is trying to lead a religious cult. The attempted transfer in power caused a schism within the community, with the breakaway group eventually moving to California. There were also debates within the community about at what age children should be introduced to amorous congress, and about whom should have the honor of making said introductions. Some of the community members were also growing increasingly fed up with the practice of complex marriage altogether and were voicing desires to become monogamous. To cap everything off, there were also impending legal troubles caused by the oftentimes quite illegal amorous activities in which the cult was known to engage. Everything came to a head in 1879 when Noyes was advised by a friend that a warrant had been issued for his arrest for engaging in amorous congress with a person who was unable to give their consent due to being too young. Upon being faced with the consequences of his actions, Noyes poetically echoed his actions of 30 years earlier, and he fled, this time to Niagara Falls in Ontario, Canada, never to return. Shortly after his arrival in Canada, he sent a letter back to his followers in Oneida recommending that the practice of complex marriage be abandoned, and it was shortly thereafter. The following year, over 70 of the community members entered into traditional marriages, and in 1880, the community was officially disbanded. Although the community was disbanded, it did not cease to exist. And this is somehow the weirdest and most unexpected twist in this story, because now we need to discuss how a bohemian sex cult rebranded itself into the world's largest manufacturer of flatware. The cult was engaged in various different economic ventures over the course of its existence, and after it was officially disbanded, it quickly reorganized itself into a joint stock company called Oneida Limited. The company was run by former cult members, many of whom continued to live at the mansion house, and they kept up their already established practice in hiring in the help of non-community members who lived in the surrounding area. The company was involved in myriad different ventures, including the manufacture and sale of animal traps, silk weaving, canning, and, most importantly, the production of flatware and hollowware. Over time, Oneida Limited concentrated its area of focus on flatware and hollowware, and it is still a major cutlery producer today, although it has desperately attempted to distance itself from its rather salacious past. And I mean, really, how many cutlery manufacturers can say that they began life as a Victorian sex cult? The last surviving member of the cult, Florence Ella Underwood, died in 1950 near Oneida, New York, at the age of 100. Noyes died in Canada in 1886. And thus ends the story of the hippie Victorian sex cult. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Once again, I'd like to remind you to please subscribe to the channel and like and subscribe and leave a comment and turn on the notification bell and follow me on Instagram and reach out to me by email if you need to for any reason. I hope that you'll join me next time when we're going to be discussing a forgotten plague that changed the face of the United States forever. Bye-bye.